So we're going to start into Hopper's New York. We read the foreword last time. Edward Hopper in his studio, New York, 1950. Photographed by George Platt Williams, the Sanborn Hopper Archive at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Francis Mulhall, Achilles Library and Archives, New York, gift of the F.A.R. Sanborn Hopper Collection and Trust. Approaching a city, Hopper, New York. It is 1950 in New York City. In the February morning light, Edward Hopper stands by his window, hands in the pockets of his wool suit, his gaze averted from the camera. He is in his studio, the heart of his modest fourth-floor walk-up residence at 3 Washington Square North, overlooking the park. Formal yet humble, the portrait captures the 67-year-old artist at the height of his career. Mere days after the opening of his largest retrospective to date at the Whitney Museum of American Art, the photographer George Platt Williams took several pictures of the famously reluctant subject that day, here catching him in a moment of reflection, positioned alongside the domestic trappings of home, a sturdy chest of drawers, a collection of ceramics, rather than the tools of his artisanal trade. Through the window, Judson Memorial Church and its attendant campanile can be seen to the south, a view that Hopper depicted once in a then unfinished painting. Doesn't look like it, but it said 52. It must have been 15 or 20 years ago. I didn't finish it. Maybe I will someday. He had lived on the top floor of this brick-faced row house since 1913. The generous windows and skylights helped to expand the space indoors, while the park offered an urban variety front yard in which to stroll, read the newspaper, think, and look. It would remain his home and place of work for more than 5 decades, during which time his Greenwich Village neighborhood and the city at large would experience a tremendous period of urban development. As the artist's own position grew from relative obscurity to national eminence, Hopper's retrospective at the Whitney Museum, located at the time on West 8th Street, just 1 block north of the studio, featured more than 170 of the artist's paintings, watercolors, and prints, a substantial portion of his output to that point. More than half of the paintings on view took inspiration from New York, from the early impressions of rooftops to later works in which the city served as a backdrop for evocative distillations of urban experience. The opera that reflected the deep, endearing hold the city had exerted upon Hopper throughout his career. The reception of the show, which was organized by Whitney curator and the artist's longtime champion Lloyd Goodrich, revealed Hopper had achieved an appeal that extended far beyond city limits. Life magazine anointed him the major American artist of the century, and fellow artist Charles Birchfield described him as one of America's most original and powerful creators. In his work, Hopper appeared to capture the experience of living in one of the world's fastest-growing metropolises in a manner in which change and changelessness could coexist, and New York could reflect both a specific place intensely observed and the broader sensations associated with modern urban life. You start building your private New York the first time you lay eyes on it, Colonel Whitehead mused in the introduction to a series of vignettes about city life. Indeed, Hopper's New York was a product of his personal experiences in the city throughout his lifetime, of the particular ways that he engaged with the sights and sensations around him, the painstaking deliberateness with which he absorbed, reflected upon, and refined his impressions. "I'm thinking out my picture," he once responded to a neighbor who approached him as he sat idly in a park. Can be gleaned from his pace of output, which increasingly averaged but 2 or 3 canvases a year. New York had played a central role in Hopper's life since his childhood, when he traveled to the city for theater and other outings with his family from their home in Nyack, less than 30 miles north of Manhattan. In 1899, he made the shift from tourist to commuter while attending art schools in the city, and moved there full-time in 1908, earning his first paychecks as a commercial illustrator while holding tight to his painterly aspirations. Hopper tried out different neighborhoods, as many individuals do in the city of renters, first living at a studio at 244 West 14th Street, and then an apartment at 53rd East 59th Street, before settling into his Washington Square perch. Such settlers as E.B. White, renowned chronicler of the city, described this type of urbanite in 1949, were uniquely positioned to absorb New York with the fresh eyes of an adventurer. Ironically, it was in Gloucester, Massachusetts, during one of his regular summer sojourns to paint in coastal New England, that Hopper crossed paths with a former art school classmate who shared his intrinsic devotion to New York. Josephine Verstill Nivenson was also spending the summer of 1923 painting outdoors away from her apartment in Greenwich Village. The two married the following year, he 42, she 41, and they lived and worked together at 3 Washington Square North for the rest of their lives, decamping during the summers to East Coast destinations like Cape Cod, where they built a home in 1934, or spending several weeks on road trips further afield. Much has been said of the couple's sometimes tempestuous union and diametrically opposing personalities. His introverted, silent, even stalwart tendencies at odds with her voluble nature. Sometimes talking with Eddie is just like dropping a stone in the well, except that it doesn't thump when it hits bottom, Joe noted. But they stayed with each other, although each had already begun forging a private New York, having lived separate lives in the city for several years. Their New Yorks overlapped in significant ways. They both loved the theater and took advantage of the city's world-renowned offerings, sometimes attending multiple productions together in a single week. Their shared disinterest in cooking, the apartment's tiny kitchen alcove would have made boiling water challenging enough, prompted them to eat out frequently and to enjoy the city's modern conveniences, like inexpensive restaurants, cafeterias, and automats, all of which in turn inspired Hopper's artistic ruminations. The Hoppers also shared a deep belief in the preservation of the city's histories, most notably traced through its buildings and most acutely felt in fear of losing their own. In 1947, they narrowly avoided eviction as they fought against the encroachment of New York University and the threat posed by development to the residential character of their beloved neighborhood, remaining an ongoing concern. In a letter to the Washington Square Committee in 1950, the year of his Whitney retrospective, Hopper argued the buildings on either side of Fifth Avenue on the north side of the square seem to be about all that is left that retains the character of one of the country's finest and most historic heritages. No more tall buildings should be built here. The Hoppers had seen countless peers pushed out of their housing as the city made way for the next best thing, from skyscrapers to subway lines. Though their advocacy largely took form on a typewriter rather than on picket lines, they shared many ideals of the growing number of activists whose skepticism of urban renewal projects would soon find a powerful voice in the work of Jane Jacobs and her paradigm-shifting Death and Life of Great American Cities, in which she advocated for mingling buildings that vary in age and condition, including a good proportion of old ones. Hopper gave visual form to certain of these ideas in his 1946 canvas, Approaching a City, a work that emblematizes the moment of entry into New York without landmarks or fanfare, but rather a stretch of ordinary buildings tightly packed against one another. Throughout his career, Hopper spoke through architecture and gave narrative authority to the common structures and out-of-the-way corners he passed, rather than to the iconic buildings and picturesque views many of his peers gravitated to. Here the building types, from the 19th century brownstone to the modern industrial structure at far left, suggest the passage of time and the histories that coexist, pictured as a single mass of forms seen from the train tracks below. A concrete retaining wall cuts above across the center of the composition and blocks the bottom portion of the buildings, where details like street numbers and storefront signage are suppressed from view. The looming dark tunnel amplifies a sense of the unknown or unknowable ahead, creating a particular frisson. As Hopper later reflected on this painting, there is a certain fear and anxiety and a great visual interest in the things that one sees coming into a great city. A trip today to the same spot at East 97th Street and Park Avenue where Hopper traveled in January 1946 to make sketches for this painting delights as much as it perplexes. The basic composition is there, the stretch of buildings, the sunken track, and the dark portal through which commuter trains rush daily, delivering tens of thousands of passengers to Grand Central Station. But unlike the preparatory drawings that documented what he saw, Hopper's painting offers a personal reflection. You won't find his buildings along Park Avenue, nor would you have encountered them during his lifetime, as contemporaneous photographs of the site attest. Hopper's intentions in his painting, as he articulated a few years earlier, were to project upon canvas my most intimate reaction to the subject as it appears when I like it the most, and the facts are given unity by my interests and prejudices. His work was built from intensive looking, but also a highly subjective process of synthesis, on paper, on canvas, and in his mind. Shortly after this painting was made, Hopper further described the struggle he felt between working from the fact and improvising, admitting that he often felt torn between the two. Hopper's choice to depict the moment of passage into the city in 1946, after he had been making such trips for decades, demonstrates a certain reverence he maintained for the powerful sensory experience of entering a city, one that is felt anew each time and yet builds on layers of memories from trips past. The scene may be drawn from New York, but there's also a tremendous openness generated in the artist's decision to call it simply a city. The ever-renewing sense of mystery and discovery particular to the urban experience can be felt by anyone who, like Hopper, finds themselves explorers on their own turf. Getting off a bus stop in a new neighborhood, taking a different side street along a familiar course, or even walking through one's neighborhood at night. One evening, the Hoppers received a surprise visit at 3 Washington Square North from a reporter who, among other things, asked them what they did for fun in the city. We're not spectacular, we're very private, and we don't drink, and we hardly ever smoke, Jadol rattled off protectively. Edward simply replied, I get most of my pleasure out of the city itself. Hopper's New York is a city that revels in the interplay between urban space and imagination. the city as it existed and as the artist willed it to be. Like millions of fellow New Yorkers before and since, for whom the city holds an undeniable magnetism despite its difficulties and disillusionments, Hopper stayed. In his penultimate year of life, Hopper maintained that New York was the American city that I know best and like most. And in many ways, his New York resonates still today, in the collective memory of the city's histories, but no less so in the actuality of lived urban existence. For Hopper, New York, as an idea, as an entity, began to take shape on the deck of the commuter ferry beginning in 1899. He traveled from Nyack by train along the western banks of the Hudson to New Jersey, where he caught one of the ferries across the river to Manhattan. From there, he transferred to the elevated train to his final destination. First to the New York School of Illustrating at West 34th Street, and then a couple years later to the New York School of Art on West 57th Street. New York had only consolidated in 1898, annexing Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, and ferries still constituted its primary connection with the outside world. The significant time Hopper spent in transit inspired many of his earlier depictions of the city, and his paintings and sketches of ferries, L stations, and train guards reflect his curiosity and absorption. The expansive view afforded by the ferry also would have allowed the young artist to observe firsthand the dramatic sky boom underway in Lower Manhattan, the epicenter of New York's record-breaking construction of tall buildings during the first decade of the 20th century. Once primarily a horizontal field of densely built human-scale buildings, the city became, over a short period of time, increasingly vertical. The building craze captured the public imagination, and many artists cast their eyes upward to the soaring heights around them, celebrating not only the feats of engineering, but also New York's newly won stature as a capital on the rise, an aesthetic epitomized in Alfred Stieglitz's 1910 photograph, The City of Ambition, which you're seeing now. Taken just down the river from where Hopper's ferry docked. One of Hopper's early establishing shots of New York, Rooftops of Ferry Slip, offers a decidedly different take. The modest painting captures the moments of final approach into the ferry slip rather than the awe-inspiring view of the new skyline from afar. If Walt Whitman described New York as a city of magnificent interest, says, Hopper offers the commuter variety, the moment when one readies for transition, gathers coat and bag, and braces for the jostle and bustle ahead. Nearly the entire lower half of the intimate work is cloaked in darkness, extending from the roaming water below to the outstretched pier that will soon deliver the boat's passengers. Above the solid horizontal mass of the ferry slip's rooftops, three architectural elements put themselves into view. A set of row houses on the left, a pair of smokestacks at the right, and at center, a generic gray protrusion representing a high-rise in the distance. Daubs of black paint on this simple flat form suggest top-floor windows, but this detail does little to elevate the shorthand rendering beyond the irreverent comic intrusion that Hopper likely intended. If an element of intrigue existed for Hopper in the tall buildings that were quickly becoming synonymous with urban modernity, it was in their capacity for awkwardness, in their gracelessness, and inability to coexist alongside buildings that came before. Rather than celebrate these new heights, Hopper's Rooftop of Ferry Slip offers a satiric reflection on the city's obsession with the vertical. Hopper's most influential instructors at the New York School of Art, Robert Henri A key figure within the group is social realists known as the Ashcan School, which also included Hopper's peer and fellow student, George Bellows. Henri implored his students to be sketch hunters, to explore the city by foot and embrace the beauty and grittiness of their surroundings in order to depict the realities of life in the rapidly changing city. Hopper was well versed in this approach, and indeed his lifelong dedication to searching for subjects for intense looking reflected something of this training, but Hopper staunchly resisted some of the more overt social critique identified with these urban realists. Unlike contemporaries such as Bellows and Marsh, Hopper left out the city's crowds of people and its booming immigrant population, prompting the nagging question of what Hopper chose to overlook, given what he would have seen. In the anonymity and nearly uniform whiteness of his figures when they appear at all, Hopper fails to take into account the complexity of the urban population, as one contemporary art historian has argued, and drains the population of the particularities of racial and class encounters. These considerations are a critical reminder that New York has always been a personal reflection of the city, with all the limitations this carries with it. When Hopper left art school, he began pursuing the advertising and illustration work that would sharpen his visual acuity and pay the bills. His burgeoning commercial career, punctuated by 3 short stays in Paris between 1906 and 1910, at a time when New York was in the throes of an incessant cycle of destruction and new construction, Paris appeared to Hopper seemingly frozen in time, a very graceful and beautiful city, almost too formal and too sweet to the taste after the raw disorder of New York. As he wrote to his mother during his first trip, everything seems to have been planned with the purpose of forming a most harmonious whole. It was the dynamics of the city itself, not its vibrant art scene, that captured Hopper's attention in Paris. He registered remarkably little interest in the groundbreaking work of the avant-garde artists who were revolutionizing painting at the time. His visit to the 1906 Salon d'Automne, which figured 10 canvases by Cézanne and several Fauvist works, yielded a report home that described it as, for the most part, very bad. But when the weather cooperated, Hopper painted outdoors, a practice he rarely adopted in New York. In doing so, he developed a noticeably impressionistic approach to color and light in his depictions of Parisian scenes, streets, buildings, and parks. In most of these compositions, he captured the urban stage without actors, focusing instead on the ways landscape and architecture were carefully circumscribed within their planning. Yet he took note of the way Parisians occupied and experienced their human-scale city in the streets and cafes at all times, not as they are in New York. Le Point d'Arts, the first of many canvases Hopper dedicated to bridges, offers a glimpse of how these engineered expanses allowed for greater freedom of movement for pedestrians, as a stream of individuals rendered through gestural brushstrokes cascades across the elegant footbridge connecting the left bank and the Louvre. The canvas was painted but a few hundred meters from where Hopper stayed at the 48 Rue de Lille, which, like the view just around the corner captured in Après-midi de Lune, which you just saw, reflects his almost exclusive focus on subjects within his immediate environs. Years later, Hopper recalled with great specificity such locations, drawing on the memories he'd consolidated of these places in his past. I could just go a few steps and I'd see the Louvre across the river. From the corner of the Rue des Bacs and Lille, you could see Sacré-Cœur. It hung like a great vision in the air above the city. In Paris, Hopper developed a sense for how to frame the world around him, how to compose a space on canvas that reflects that which has already been designed. There are a great many old New Yorkers who have escaped to Paris in order to avoid the spectacle of the radical changes coming too rapidly over the character of their beloved city. Hopper's friend and fellow artist Guy Pen Du Bois remarked, as much as Hopper absorbed from his days in Paris, he was anxious to return to New York in 1910, and he surveyed the city around him with renewed interest. Here too, his location scouting began close to home. From his apparent on East 59th Street, the entrance to the Queensboro Bridge was just a short walk away. This monumental expanse between Queens and Manhattan had only recently opened to rail, pedestrian, and vehicular traffic in 1909, its debut coinciding with that of the Manhattan Bridge and capping an astounding decade of engineering feats that included the 1903 opening of the Williamsburg Bridge as well. Over the next 2 decades, Hopper took on each of these bridges as a subject in his work, responding to their workaday qualities and unique city views. Conspicuously absent from this list is the Brooklyn Bridge, with its picture postcard status and renowned Gothic arches that immediately came to be used as an artistic and literary motif symbolizing majesty and progress. It may have been too iconic a subject for Hopper. Instead, the artist increasingly sought out subjects where the awkward collisions of new and old, public and private, civic and residential, allowed him a more nuanced address of the complex dynamics of the growing city without polemics. Such is the case in the 2 paintings Hopper made of the Queensboro Bridge that dates brookening his residency at East 59th Street. In Blackwell's Island, Hopper situates the beholder halfway across the pedestrian walkway on the bridge's south side, capturing an embodied perspective 130 feet above what is today known as Roosevelt Island. And with the East River and Queens waterfront just beyond, the moonlit scene grants little detail of the experience only being here 2 years later in Queensboro Bridge. Hopper drew back the lens, showcasing the bridge as a hulking expanse whose support structures overwhelm the pastoral landscape and tidy domestic setting on the island below. The incongruous nature of these elements underscores a certain urban uncanny that had become increasingly common amid the city's breakneck development. So these are the 2 paintings mentioned. So I think reading that other one is actually making me appreciate this more, since that had some very broad strokes narratives of his life, and this you're getting a very different perspective, since that one you heard all about his trips, and this one's barely mentioned. On the massive penitentiary that, along with a smallpox hospital, covered much of the island's southern end and would have appeared just to the right of the frame in Queensboro Bridge. In fact, the quaint home that Hopper pictured on the island was based on the warden's residence, situated in that location. Bellows focused on another subject that Hopper kept outside his frame, the remains of the massive demolition projects that made the bridge's construction possible. If Hopper's Queensboro Bridge highlighted the city's growing pains through awkward architectural juxtaposition, Bellows revealed the dramatic loss and human dislocation associated with such growth. The area above 59th Street inspired another city scene, New York Corner Saloon. Yet this work neither in its subject nor title makes explicit reference to a precise place. Instead, it introduces Hopper's approach to many of his city subjects when grounded in his familiarity with specific sites. The smokestack suggests the proximity of a river, while the streetcar tracks emulate those that rounded the corners of 59th Street and 2nd Avenue, as well as 59th and 3rd, only a few blocks east from Hopper's apartment. Although saloons occupied many of these east side corners at the time, as lease records attest, Hopper resists claims to any one in particular, a point he emphasizes by rendering the letter on the gilded cornice illegible. A series of open-ended visual cues, a barbershop pole, a newsstand display, an assortment of window dressings that indicate various tenants within demonstrates that this is an active corner at a transitional moment in the day. It is a New York corner, a type, not a specific destination. When Hopper first exhibited New York Corner in a 1915 group exhibition at the MacDowell Club, he presented it alongside a painting inspired by Paris. Edward Hopper is not quite so successful with his Soir Bleu, a group of hardened Parisian absence drinkers, one reviewer commented, but he is entirely so with his New York Corner. Another critic described the painting as a visualization of New York atmosphere. Hopper continued to exhibit his Paris paintings in group shows over the next several years, despite the lack of critical attention and collectors they attracted. And they accounted for 11 of the 16 works he presented in his first solo exhibition at the Whitney Studio Club in 1920. But after the critical silence continued, he finally shelved these works to focus exclusively on American subjects. We're going to end here. We'll pick this up most likely on Monday. I've got something a bit different planned for tomorrow. We may or may not continue Game Wizards tonight.